The grand marble columns of the Supreme Court hearing room loomed over the proceedings as Justice Samuel Alito leaned forward, his face a mask of controlled disdain. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood at the podium, her bright red blazer a stark contrast against the wood-paneled walls, her expression calm but determined. What happened next shocked everyone in attendance. "Justice Alito," Crockett began, her voice steady as steel, "before I begin my arguments today, I'd like to quote something I found rather interesting." She paused, her eyes locked directly with his. "These aren't my words, but yours." The room fell silent as she pulled out a document, the paper crisp under the bright lights. Alito's expression shifted slightly, a faint crease forming between his eyebrows. "You once wrote, and I quote, 'The Constitution makes no mention of abortion, and no such right is implicitly protected by any constitutional provision.' That was your opinion in Dobbs." She let those words hang in the air for a moment. "Yet today, I intend to show how you've applied a completely different standard to other rights you personally favor." Justice Alito's face flushed red as whispers erupted across the chamber. The Chief Justice reached for his gavel, but before he could call for order, Congresswoman Crockett continued, "What happens when a justice's own words become their greatest weakness? We're about to find out." And this wasn't just another congressional hearing. This was about to become the confrontation that would shake the Supreme Court to its very foundation. Don't forget to like and subscribe to catch more shocking political confrontations like this one. The full story of how Congresswoman Crockett systematically dismantled one of America's most powerful justices is about to unfold. Justice Samuel Alito had served on the Supreme Court for 18 years. Appointed by President George W. Bush in 2006, he had built a reputation as one of the most conservative members of the court. At 74 years old, his salt and pepper hair and perpetual scowl had become almost iconic in legal circles. A graduate of Princeton and Yale law, Alito had spent decades carefully crafting his judicial philosophy, one that claimed to adhere strictly to the original text and meaning of the Constitution. Over the years, his opinions had reshaped American law on issues from reproductive rights to religious freedom, always leaning toward conservative outcomes. Critics often accused him of cherry-picking history and precedent to match his personal beliefs, but Alito had largely remained insulated from direct confrontation, protected by the Supreme Court's traditional isolation from political theater. Until today, across from him stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a rising star in the Democratic Party. At 43, the Texas representative and former civil rights attorney had quickly made a name for herself as a fearless questioner who came to hearings meticulously prepared. With her law degree from the University of Houston and years of experience defending the marginalized, Crockett brought both legal expertise and lived experience to her role. Her journey to Congress had been anything but easy. As a Black woman from Missouri who built her career in Texas, she had faced obstacles at every turn. Yet those challenges had forged her into a formidable advocate, unafraid to challenge power directly. Her election to Congress in 2022 had sent a clear message. A new generation of leaders was coming, and they wouldn't be intimidated by tradition or status. Today's hearing before the House Judiciary Committee was supposed to be routine, a standard oversight session where justices answered questions about court administration and judicial philosophy. Such hearings were typically cordial affairs, with representatives showing deference to the lifetime appointed justices. Most questions were submitted in advance, allowing justices to prepare carefully crafted responses. But Congresswoman Crockett had other plans? For weeks, she and her staff had been combing through Justice Alito's record, reading every opinion, dissent, and public statement. They'd compiled a document highlighting contradictions in his judicial philosophy, instances where his application of constitutional interpretation seemed to change based on the issue at hand. The stakes were enormous. The Supreme Court's credibility was already at a historic low, with public approval ratings having plummeted after controversial decisions on abortion, voting rights, and presidential power. Ethics scandals involving luxury trips, property deals, and political activism by justices' spouses had further eroded public trust. For Justice Alito, this hearing represented a threat to his carefully constructed image as a principled originalist. Any exposed inconsistencies could damage not just his personal legacy, but the legitimacy of the court's recent landmark decisions. For Congresswoman Crockett, the risks were equally high. directly challenging a Supreme Court justice could either establish her as a principled defender of judicial integrity or be dismissed as partisan grandstanding. The line between the two was razor thin, and success would depend entirely on her preparation and execution. Justice Alito, Crockett continued, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber, you've built your career on the idea that the Constitution should be interpreted according to its original text and meaning. You've repeatedly stated that rights not explicitly mentioned in the document should not be recognized unless they were deeply rooted in our nation's history and tradition. Alito nodded cautiously, his face revealing nothing. Yet, I've noticed a pattern where this standard seems to apply differently depending on the case before you. She arranged her notes methodically. Today, I'd like to examine that pattern, because the American people deserve consistency from their highest court. The room tensed as Alito straightened in his chair. Other justices exchanged glances, sensing this would not be the routine hearing they had expected. The committee chairman checked his watch nervously. Congresswoman, I've always applied the same constitutional standards regardless of the issue, Alito responded, his tone measured but with an edge of defensiveness. The court's role is to interpret the law, not make it. Crockett smiled slightly. Then you won't mind if we examine some specific examples, Justice Alito. Let's begin with comparing your approach in Dobbs, which overturned Roe v. Wade, with your approach in other cases involving unenumerated rights. As she opened a thick binder of case documents, it became clear to everyone in the room she had come armed with receipts. And Justice Alito was about to face the most challenging cross-examination of his career. Justice Alito, Congresswoman Crockett began, her voice projecting confidence throughout the hearing room. In Dobbs, you wrote that rights not mentioned in the Constitution must be deeply rooted in our nation's history and tradition to be protected. You found that abortion rights failed this test. Is that an accurate summary of your position? Alito nodded, his expression guarded. Yes, Congresswoman, the court cannot simply create rights that aren't grounded in constitutional text or historical tradition. I see, Crockett replied, turning a page in her binder. Then let's talk about New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin, where you joined Justice Thomas's majority opinion significantly expanding gun rights. The opinion recognized a right to carry firearms in public, something not explicitly stated in the Second Amendment's text. She paused, looking directly at him. Could you explain why the right to carry guns in public passes your deeply rooted in history test, while women's control over their own bodies, something practiced throughout American history, fails it? A murmur rippled through the audience. Alito shifted uncomfortably in his seat before leaning toward his microphone. Those cases involve different constitutional provisions with different histories, he responded, his tone becoming slightly defensive. The Second Amendment explicitly protects the right to keep and bear arms. No such explicit protection exists for abortion. Crockett nodded, seemingly accepting his answer before countering. Yet the Ninth Amendment clearly states that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Doesn't that suggest the founders expected some rights to be protected, despite not being explicitly listed? Before Alito could respond, she continued, and if we're examining history, records show that abortion was legal under common law in all 13 colonies until quickening, roughly 16 weeks. Many of the founders' own medical textbooks contained instructions for it. The Chief Justice intervened. Congresswoman, Justice Alito has explained the court's reasoning in these cases. Perhaps we could move to another topic. I'm simply trying to understand the consistent application of Justice Alito's judicial philosophy, Crockett replied smoothly. Let me approach this differently. She pulled out another document. Justice Alito, in Carson v. Macon, you voted to require taxpayer funding of religious education, something certainly not mentioned in the Constitution and historically opposed by many founders, including James Madison, who wrote that forcing citizens to fund religious instruction was sinful and tyrannical. She looked up. So it seems the deeply rooted in history test didn't apply there either. Would you agree this represents an inconsistency in your approach? Alito's jaw tightened visibly. That case involved the Free Exercise Clause, which has its own jurisprudence and historical understanding. Crockett pressed forward. Let's move to another example. In your Citizens United concurrence, you supported the idea that corporations have First Amendment rights. Corporations being entities not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution and certainly not considered persons with rights by the founders. Shifting tactics, she pulled out a chart displayed on screens around the room. I've prepared a visualization comparing 20 of your opinions. The blue dots represent cases where you've strictly limited rights based on text and history. The red dots show where you've expanded rights beyond explicit text despite limited historical support. Notice anything, Justice Alito? The chart clearly showed blue dots clustered around cases involving voting rights, reproductive freedom, and criminal justice, while red dots predominated in cases involving religious rights, gun ownership, and corporate power. This visualization clearly shows... Objection, Alito interrupted sharply, his composure beginning to crack. This is a grossly misleading characterization of complex legal decisions. I haven't characterized anything yet, Justice Alito, Crockett replied calmly. I simply displayed your voting record, but since you mention it, let me ask directly, do you apply different standards of constitutional interpretation depending on whether you personally agree with the right in question? Gasps echoed through the chamber. Such a direct accusation of judicial bias against a sitting Supreme Court justice was almost unprecedented. Alito's face flushed deeper red. That is an offensive question and a misrepresentation of my judicial record. I have always followed the same constitutional principles, regardless of the issue. Then perhaps you can explain this, Crockett responded, displaying a split screen of 2 Alito quotes. On the left, your statement in Dobbs, the Constitution makes no reference to abortion, and no such right is implicitly protected by any constitutional provision. On the right, your dissent in Obergefell, arguing against same-sex marriage, where you wrote about the freedom to marry being essential to individual autonomy, despite marriage not being mentioned in the Constitution either. The room erupted with whispers as spectators leaned forward in their seats. Several journalists hurriedly typed on their phones, capturing quotes in real time. Those statements are taken out of context, Alito responded, his voice rising slightly. Constitutional analysis requires examining specific provisions, not isolated quotes. Context is precisely what I'm providing, Justice Alito, Crockett countered. Let me add more context with another example. She pulled up a video clip from Alito's confirmation hearings. Here you are in 2006, stating the Constitution applies to everyone. No one is above the law. Yet in Trump v. Vance, you dissented against requiring a president to comply with a valid subpoena, effectively placing him above the law. Metcalfe involved complex separation of powers questions. Alito began. Crockett cut in. Speaking of separation of powers, I'd like to discuss your wife Martha Ann's political activism. Public records show she attended the January 6th rally and has donated to candidates who promote the view that the 2020 election was stolen. Claims you would potentially rule on this crossed a line. Alito's professional demeanor finally cracked. My wife's activities are her own and have no bearing on my judicial decisions, he snapped, voice rising sharply. This line of questioning is inappropriate and irrelevant to this hearing's purpose. The committee chairman banged his gavel. The Congresswoman will stick to questions about judicial philosophy and court operations. With all due respect, Mr. Chairman, Crockett responded firmly, judicial ethics and potential conflicts of interest are squarely within the scope of this oversight hearing. She turned back to Alito, whose face had now turned a deep shade of crimson. Justice Alito, you were photographed at your home flying a Let's Go Brandon flag, widely understood as a coded insult to President Biden. How do you reconcile this with Canon 1 of the Code of Conduct for Federal Judges, which requires judges to maintain the appearance of impartiality? The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Alito, whose breathing had become visibly labored. The Chief Justice leaned over to whisper something, but Alito waved him off. The flag was put up during a dispute with a neighbor, he replied tersely, and the Code of Conduct doesn't formally apply to the Supreme Court. So you acknowledge the Supreme Court operates with fewer ethical constraints than any other court in the country? Crockett asked, her tone genuinely inquisitive rather than accusatory. The court has its own internal procedures, Alito began, like Justice Thomas deciding for himself whether to recuse from cases involving his wife's activities, or Justice Gorsuch failing to disclose property deals with lawyers who had cases before the court? Crockett interjected. This seems relevant to understanding how you apply rules differently, depending on who they affect. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. Several Republican committee members were frantically signaling to the chairman, who looked increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of questioning. A Democratic member spoke up. The Congresswoman has time remaining and is asking legitimate oversight questions. The chairman reluctantly nodded for Crockett to continue. She turned back to Alito, whose composure was visibly deteriorating. Justice Alito, one final question in this round. You've repeatedly claimed to be an originalist who interprets the Constitution according to its original public meaning. Yet scholars have documented numerous instances where your historical claims contain significant errors or omissions. She held up a law review article. This peer-reviewed study identifies 17 historical claims in your Dobbs opinion that contradict the historical record, including your assertion that abortion was always a crime under common law. How do you respond to scholarly criticism that your use of history is selective and sometimes inaccurate? Alito's control finally shattered completely. He slammed his hand on the table, causing his water glass to topple and spill across his notes. "This is nothing but a politically motivated attack," he exclaimed, voice rising to nearly a shout. "You're deliberately distorting my record to score political points. The Supreme Court deserves more respect than this partisan circus." The outburst sent shockwaves through the room. Journalists frantically captured the moment, photographers' cameras clicked rapidly, and even fellow justices looked stunned by the uncharacteristic display of emotion. The chairman banged his gavel repeatedly. "Order! We will take a 15-minute recess." As staff rushed to clean up the spilled water and attendees began buzzing with conversation, Crockett remained calmly at her seat, organizing her notes. She hadn't raised her voice once, yet had managed to provoke one of the most powerful jurists in America into a public meltdown. The first phase of her strategy had worked perfectly. Justice Alito had lost control, and everyone had witnessed it. When the hearing resumed, the atmosphere in the chamber had transformed. The earlier tension had crystallized into something more charged, a sense that history was being made. Additional media had somehow squeezed into the room during the recess, and smartphones were angled to capture every moment despite the committee's rules against recording. Justice Alito had regained his composure during the break, his face once again an impassive judicial mask, though a slight tremor in his hand betrayed his continued agitation as he sipped from a fresh glass of water. His colleagues on the bench appeared uncomfortable, some staring straight ahead while others whispered among themselves. Congresswoman Crockett returned to her seat with the same calm determination she had shown throughout. If anything, her demeanor seemed even more focused, her posture straighter as she organized her notes with methodical precision. The chairman cleared his throat. "The committee will come to order. Congresswoman Crockett, you may continue your questioning, but I remind you to maintain appropriate decorum." "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she replied, her voice level and professional. "Justice Alito, I apologize if my previous questions caused any discomfort. My goal is not to provoke, but to understand the consistent application of judicial principles on our highest court." Alito gave a curt nod, clearly bracing himself for what might come next. "I'd like to focus now on what I believe is the core issue," Crockett said, her tone shifting to one of genuine concern rather than confrontation. "The American people's trust in the Supreme Court has fallen to historic lows, just 27% according to the most recent Gallup poll. This crisis of legitimacy threatens one of our democracy's fundamental institutions." She paused, letting the gravity of those statistics sink in. "Justice Alito, do you agree that public confidence in the court's impartiality is essential to its proper functioning in our system of government?" This framing was difficult to contest, and Alito recognized the trap of appearing unconcerned with the court's public standing. "Of course," he responded cautiously. "The court's legitimacy is important, though. We cannot make decisions based on polls or public opinion." "I completely agree," Crockett nodded, surprising many with this momentary alignment. "The court must follow the Constitution and the law, not public sentiment. That's precisely why consistency in legal reasoning is so crucial, to show that decisions are based on principles, not preferences." She stood and approached a display board her staff had set up during the break. On it were 2 columns of quotes, all from Justice Alito's own writings. "These are all your words, Justice Alito. The left column shows instances where you rejected rights because they weren't explicitly in the Constitution's text. The right column shows where you expanded rights despite similar textual absence." The display was devastating in its simplicity, Alito's own words contradicting each other across different cases, with citations to the original opinions making the comparison impossible to dismiss. "For example," she continued, pointing to specific quotes, "here you wrote that substantive due process has been a proven failure when rejecting protections for same-sex couples. Yet here, you embrace substantive due process to protect religious organizations from employment discrimination laws." She turned back to face him directly. The pattern suggests that your interpretative approach changes based on whose rights are at stake. Alito began to respond, but Crockett raised her hand slightly. Before you answer, I want to emphasize that I'm not questioning your integrity or intentions. Implicit bias affects us all, but when justices apply different standards to different groups, it creates exactly the crisis of legitimacy we're seeing today. This approach, acknowledging the institutional stakes while focusing on documented inconsistencies rather than personal attacks, left Alito with few effective responses. Congresswoman, he began, his voice tight with controlled frustration. These cases involve different constitutional provisions with different histories and precedents. Comparing isolated quotes without that context creates a misleading impression. Then let me add context, Crockett replied, her voice taking on a teacher's patient clarity. She moved to an easel with a timeline of American legal history. In Dobbs, you claimed abortion restrictions were deeply rooted in history. Yet abortion was legal in every state at the founding until quickening, roughly 20 weeks. The restrictions you cited came primarily from the 1,860 S. A period when women couldn't vote or serve on juries. She moved her pointer along the timeline. Meanwhile, in Bruin, you joined an opinion-finding public gun carrying, deeply rooted in tradition, based largely on post-Civil War cases, the exact same historical period you dismissed as irrelevant in Dobbs. The room had grown completely silent, with even Alito's fellow justices watching the methodical dismantling of his judicial consistency. The problem isn't that you're conservative, Justice Alito, Crockett continued, her voice gaining strength without raising in volume. It's that you appear to use history selectively to reach preferred outcomes rather than as a neutral tool of interpretation. She returned to her seat and picked up another document. Your opinions repeatedly cite historical sources in ways that scholars in those fields have contested. When Professor Mary Ziegler, a legal historian specializing in reproductive rights, pointed out historical inaccuracies in your Dobbs opinion, you dismissed her work as politics, not scholarship. Yet you regularly cite non-legal academics whose views align with your own. Alito's jaw tensed visibly. The court must make its own determinations about historical evidence. Indeed, Crockett agreed. But shouldn't that determination be consistent across cases? When gun rights are at issue, you examine history broadly and accept post-founding developments as relevant. When abortion rights are at issue, you narrow the historical lens and dismiss similar evidence. She leaned forward, her expression genuinely concerned rather than triumphant. Justice Alito, the American people can accept conservative jurisprudence. What they struggle with is the appearance of results-driven reasoning disguised as principled interpretation. A Republican committee member interjected, "Mr. Chairman, the Congresswoman is badgering the witness and making accusations rather than asking questions." "I'm citing Justice Alito's own words and decisions," Crockett responded calmly. "If examining a justice's public record constitutes badgering, then meaningful oversight becomes impossible." The chairman hesitated, then allowed her to continue. Crockett turned back to Alito. "Let me ask directly, do you believe your approach to constitutional interpretation has been consistent across different types of cases and different groups of Americans?" Alito, recognizing the no-win nature of the question, attempted to redirect. "My approach has always been to interpret the Constitution according to its text, history, and tradition. Different provisions require different analyses." "Then let's look at the same provision applied differently," Crockett countered, displaying two more Alito quotes side by side. "Here's your application of the Equal Protection Clause to affirmative action policies, where you rejected any consideration of race. And here's your application of the same clause to partisan gerrymandering, where you argued courts should not intervene despite obvious unequal treatment of voters." She set down the document. "Same constitutional provision, different outcomes. The variable seems to be whose equality is at stake." The room remained silent as the methodical exposure continued. This wasn't a partisan attack, but a precise, evidence-based deconstruction of a justice's inconsistent jurisprudence using nothing but his own words. "Justice Alito," Crockett continued, her voice now carrying a note of genuine appeal, "I believe you care deeply about the Constitution and the court as an institution. So I'm asking you to reflect on whether these inconsistencies might contribute to the legitimacy crisis the court now faces. Alito sat rigidly in his chair, the trap now fully sprung. To deny the inconsistencies would require explaining away his own written words. To acknowledge them would undermine the legitimacy of his jurisprudence. After a painfully long silence, he responded with measured words. Congresswoman, I reject the premise that my jurisprudence has been inconsistent. What appears as contradiction to you reflects the complex nature of constitutional analysis applied to different factual and legal contexts. Crockett nodded, appearing to accept his answer while preparing her final move. Then perhaps you can explain one last contradiction that seems particularly difficult to reconcile? She displayed a final split screen. On one side, Alito's statement in Dobbs that a right to abortion is not deeply rooted in the nation's history and traditions, and on the other, his dissent in Obergefell, where he had written that the Constitution leaves the issue of same-sex marriage to be decided by the people of each state. In one case, you say the Constitution prohibits recognizing a right not deeply rooted in history. In another, you say the Constitution requires leaving the issue to the states. Both cannot be true simultaneously. She paused, letting the contradiction hang in the air. This appears less like consistent constitutional interpretation and more like reaching a preferred outcome through whatever reasoning gets you there. The silence that followed was deafening. Several justices shifted uncomfortably in their seats, journalists frantically typed notes, committee members from both parties seemed transfixed by the exchange. Finally, Alito spoke, his voice betraying a slight tremor despite his evident effort at control. Constitutional law is complex, Congresswoman. Apparent contradictions often reflect nuances that aren't captured in brief quotes. I agree completely about constitutional complexity, Crockett replied, her tone shifting to one of respectful conclusion rather than continued attack. That's precisely why rigid originalism fails as an interpretive method. It pretends simplicity where none exists and often serves as cover for inserting personal preferences into constitutional law. She gathered her notes, signaling the end of her questioning. The American people deserve justices who apply the same rules regardless of whose rights are at stake. When they see their highest court applying different standards to different groups, they rightfully question whether justice is truly blind. Looking directly at Alito, she delivered her final point. I don't question your commitment to the Constitution, Justice Alito. I question whether your approach to interpreting it has been consistent with your stated principles, because a justice who changes the rules based on the players undermines the very rule of law you've devoted your career to upholding. The chairman, sensing the moment had reached its natural conclusion, quickly called on another committee member, but it was too late. The damage had been done. In just under 15 minutes, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had systematically exposed the contradictions in Justice Alito's jurisprudence using nothing but his own words against him. She had maintained perfect composure while provoking him into an uncharacteristic emotional display, and most devastatingly, she had framed the entire exchange not as a partisan attack, but as a principled defense of judicial integrity and constitutional consistency. As the questioning moved to other committee members, the victory was clear to everyone in the room. Justice Alito sat stiffly in his chair, outwardly composed, but unmistakably defeated, his carefully constructed judicial persona now publicly dismantled by his own contradictory words. The triumph wasn't just political, it was substantive, not a gotcha moment, but a genuinely damaging exposure of results-oriented jurisprudence masquerading as principled interpretation. And it had all unfolded on national television, with millions watching a justice of the Supreme Court undone by nothing more than his own inconsistencies. The hearing concluded 3 hours later, but the real story was just beginning to unfold. As Justice Alito and his colleagues filed out of the chamber, their usual air of judicial detachment couldn't mask the tension visible in their stiff postures and averted gazes. The historical nature of the confrontation was immediately apparent to everyone present. Outside the hearing room, a swarm of reporters descended on Congresswoman Crockett, microphones thrust forward as cameras flashed. She maintained her composed demeanor, refusing to spike the football or frame the exchange as a personal victory. The day wasn't about scoring political points, she told the press gathered in the hallway. It was about constitutional consistency and the public's right to a Supreme Court that applies the same rules regardless of the issue or whose rights are at stake. When asked if she thought Justice Alito should resign, a question clearly designed to generate a headline, Crockett deftly sidestepped the trap. That's not for me to say. My role was to ask the questions the American people deserve answers to. How Justice Alito reflects on today's discussion is a matter for his conscience. This measured response only enhanced the impact of her questioning. By refusing to gloat or overreach, she cemented the impression of a principled oversight effort rather than a partisan attack. Meanwhile, the video was already spreading across social media with unprecedented speed. Clips of Alito's emotional outburst, juxtaposed with Crockett's calm persistence, generated millions of views within hours. Hashtags like Alito's own words, Crockett Creceets Day, and Supreme Contradiction began trending nationally. Legal experts from across the political spectrum weighed in, with reactions falling along predictable partisan lines. But with notable exceptions, several conservative legal scholars expressed discomfort with the clear contradictions Crockett had exposed. While I agree with Justice Alito's jurisprudential outcomes in many cases, wrote Professor Hadley Richardson of George Mason University Law School, Congresswoman Crockett raised legitimate questions about consistency and interpretive methodology that deserve serious engagement, not dismissal. Liberal legal commentators were less restrained. What we witnessed today was the emperor's new clothes moment for originalism, declared Harvard law professor Lauren Michaels on MSNBC. Representative Crockett methodically demonstrated how original public meaning often serves as cover for imposing personal policy preferences under the guise of neutral principles. By evening, major networks had assembled panels to analyze the exchange, with split screens showing Crockett's most effective moments alongside Alito's uncharacteristic emotional response. Fox News attempted to frame the hearing as disrespectful badgering of a distinguished jurist. But even their legal analysts struggled to explain away the stark contradictions Crockett had highlighted using Alito's own words. The problem for Justice Alito's defenders, noted CNN legal analyst Daniel Jacobson, is that Congresswoman Crockett didn't attack him personally. She simply quoted his own inconsistent statements side by side. That's not a partisan tactic, it's effective oversight. Inside the Supreme Court, the impact was even more profound. Sources close to the justices reported an emergency informal meeting called that evening, unusual in itself, where the implications for the court's public standing were discussed. Though no official statements emerged, court watchers noted the unprecedented nature of a justice being so effectively cornered in a public hearing. The justices are accustomed to operating in a rarefied atmosphere where their pronouncements go largely unchallenged outside academic circles, explained longtime court observer Margaret Sullivan. Today shattered that bubble in ways that will likely have lasting consequences for how the court approaches both its written opinions and public appearances. The White House maintained official silence on the matter, citing respect for judicial independence, but sources reported the president was deeply interested in the exchange and had watched extended clips with senior advisors. As night fell, Justice Alito released a terse statement through the court's public information office. Today's hearing involved complex constitutional matters that cannot be adequately addressed in sound bites. I stand by my judicial record and the consistency of my approach to constitutional interpretation. The brief, defensive response only fueled further discussion of the substantive issues Crockett had raised. By the following morning, major newspapers carried front-page headlines about the confrontation. The New York Times led with "Justice Question: Crockett Challenges Alito's Judicial Consistency," while the Washington Post opted for "Supreme Contradiction: Alito Faces His Own Words, Intense Hearing." Even the Wall Street Journal, typically sympathetic to the court's conservative wing, acknowledged the significance, with Alito's jurisprudence under scrutiny after heated exchange with Congresswoman. Legal blogs and academic discussion forums exploded with detailed analyses of the contradictions Crockett had highlighted. Law professors announced plans to incorporate the exchange into their constitutional law courses as a case study in judicial methodology and congressional oversight. What made Representative Crockett's approach so effective, wrote Yale law professor Eleanor Wynn, was that she focused on methodology rather than outcomes. She didn't argue that Alito reached the wrong conclusions, but rather that he used inconsistent methods to reach predetermined results, a criticism that strikes at the heart of judicial legitimacy. 3 days after the hearing, the real bombshell dropped. A law review article that had been in the publication pipeline, authored by 3 prominent legal historians, was rushed to online release. Titled "Selective Originalism: Historical Cherry-Picking in Supreme Court Jurisprudence," the peer-reviewed paper provided detailed documentation of historical inaccuracies and selective citation practices in several recent Supreme Court opinions, including many authored by Justice Alito. The paper's release, clearly timed to capitalize on the national conversation sparked by the hearing, provided scholarly validation for many of the points Crockett had raised. Conservative media attempted to dismiss the article as politically motivated, but its meticulous documentation and peer-reviewed status made it difficult to ignore. A week later, the story gained fresh momentum when Justice Elena Kagan, known for her strategic institutional voice on the court, gave a previously scheduled speech at Georgetown Law Center. Without mentioning the hearing or Alito directly, she emphasized the importance of judicial consistency. The court's legitimacy rests on the perception that we are applying legal principles rather than personal preferences, Kagan told the assembled law students. When our interpretive methods shift based on the issue before us, we damage that perception and undermine the rule of law itself. The remark was widely interpreted as a tacit acknowledgement of the validity of Crockett's critique and a sign of internal court divisions exposed by the hearing. For Congresswoman Crockett, the hearing transformed her national profile overnight. Interview requests flooded her office, and fundraising emails citing her confrontation with Justice Alito broke previous records. Yet she maintained a disciplined message, consistently steering conversations back to the substantive issues rather than personalizing the conflict. "This isn't about me or Justice Alito," she repeated in an interview on 60 Minutes. "It's about whether our highest court applies consistent standards or changes the rules based on ideological preferences. The American people deserve the former and increasingly suspect the latter." The long-term implications became clear as the weeks passed. Law professors reported students asking more pointed questions about interpretive consistency in constitutional law classes. Judicial nominees face more sophisticated questioning about methodological consistency in confirmation hearings, and perhaps most significantly, justices began acknowledging the issue in their opinions. In a concurrence 2 months later, Chief Justice Roberts wrote, "The court must be attentive not just to reaching the correct result, but to applying consistent interpretive methods across different constitutional provisions and different types of cases. Our legitimacy depends on it." The statement, though general in nature, was widely interpreted as a response to the issues Crockett had so effectively exposed. For Justice Alito, the hearing marked a turning point. While he continued on the court, commentators noted subtle changes in his writing, more careful acknowledgement of counter-arguments, more thorough historical documentation, and, most notably, more consistent application of interpretive principles across different types of cases. The Crockett effect, as legal observers began calling it, demonstrated the power of skilled congressional oversight to influence even the most insulated government institution, not through grandstanding or personal attacks, but through methodical, evidence-based questioning focused on substantive inconsistencies. I mean, in some senses, 6 months later, Congresswoman Crockett appeared on a panel at the American Constitution Society's annual convention, alongside several prominent constitutional scholars. Asked about the lasting impact of her exchange with Justice Alito, she offered a measured assessment. "I believe that moment opened a necessary national conversation about judicial methodology and consistency," she said. "The Supreme Court wields enormous power in our system. With that power comes a responsibility to apply the same rules regardless of the issue or whose rights are at stake. When we see inconsistencies, it's our duty as citizens and certainly as members of Congress to question them." She paused thoughtfully before continuing. "What gives me hope is that this conversation isn't partisan at its core. Conservatives and liberals alike should want a court that applies consistent principles rather than reaching for whatever interpretive tool delivers a preferred outcome. That's not about politics. It's about the integrity of our constitutional system." The audience rose in a standing ovation, not just for her confrontation with Alito, but for her principled articulation of what judicial review should mean in a constitutional democracy. As attendees filed out afterward, 2 law professors could be overheard discussing the panel. "You know what's remarkable?" said one. "She never made it personal. She just held up a mirror to Alito's own words." "And there's nothing more damaging to result-oriented judging," replied the other, "than the judge's own contradictions displayed side by side." The exchange with Justice Alito would not be the last time Congresswoman Crockett would make headlines for her methodical, evidence-based oversight, but it would remain the most consequential A moment when a prepared legislator armed with nothing but a justice's own words changed the national conversation about the Supreme Court and constitutional interpretation. The confrontation between Justice Alito and Congresswoman Crockett ultimately wasn't about conservative versus liberal jurisprudence. It was about consistency versus convenience, principle versus preference. And in exposing that distinction with such clarity, Crockett had performed perhaps the most valuable service a legislator can offer in a system of checks and balances, holding power accountable to its own stated principles. In the months and years that followed, Supreme Court observers noted a subtle but significant shift in the court's approach to explaining its decisions. Greater attention to methodological consistency, more transparent acknowledgement of historical complexities, and a heightened awareness that the public was now watching for exactly the types of contradictions Crockett had so effectively exposed. It wasn't revolution, but evolution. A necessary recalibration toward judicial humility and consistency that would ultimately strengthen the court's legitimacy rather than diminish it. And it all began with a congresswoman who came prepared, armed with nothing more dangerous than a justice's own words. If you found this political drama fascinating, don't forget to like and subscribe. Hit that notification bell to stay updated on more powerful confrontations where truth speaks to power. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on this historic exchange between Justice Alito and Congresswoman Crockett. We'll be back soon with more compelling stories of accountability in action.